There are 11,000 private wells in Perry County, Kentucky. Nearly all of them are unremarkable, dug by hand into the hillside shale, stone-lined, covered with a plank or a tin sheet, weighted down with a cinder block. They pull water up from the dark, and people drink it, and nobody thinks about it much. That's the whole story for most of them. Water goes in the bucket comes up, life continues. One of them was sealed shut in 1949 by a woman who welded the cap herself. She carried creek water for 23 years after that. Every morning, every evening, cold months and hot months. Through a hip injury she never had treated, and through 3 winters that buried the hollow in 4 feet of snow. She died in 1972 without explaining why she'd done it. The well sat sealed on that property for another 26 years, concrete holding, bolts are rusting at the threads, and nobody opened it. I know this because she was my family. Hazel Combs was my grandmother's older sister. I grew up hearing her name the way you hear names in families, attached to small stories, disconnected from each other, never quite adding up to a whole person. She was stubborn. She could weld. She kept a garden that was almost offensively productive. She carried creek water. Nobody asked why. I know the well is still sealed because I've stood over it. I drove out to the property in the spring of 2023, 25 years after my cousin Della first found it. And I stood in the grass with my boots getting damp, and I looked at the concrete cap, bolted to a steel ring sunk into the stone rim, and I thought about all the mornings Hazel walked past it to get to the creek, and I know something is still in it because I've heard it through the crack. You need to understand what Perry County looks like before you can understand what this story means. This isn't context. It's the story itself. The county sits in the heart of the Cumberland Plateau, folded into itself like something that never wanted to be found. The mountains here aren't majestic. They're close. They press in from every side of every hollow, and the hollows themselves are narrow enough that full sun only reaches the floor for a few hours a day in summer, less in winter. The creeks run brown with tannin and iron. The soil on the ridges is thin and rocky and exhausted. But down in the hollows, in the creek bottoms, where the water table sits high and the leaf rot has been composting for centuries, down there things grow. Things grow the way they're supposed to grow, the way they grew before people started keeping track of how growth is supposed to look. Hazel and Emmett Combs built their cabin on the hollow side in 1921. Emmett was 24. Hazel was 23, already missing the ring finger on her left hand from a threshing belt that caught her at 19, and already the kind of woman who looked at a problem and started solving it before she'd finished deciding whether it was her problem to solve. They dug the well themselves that first summer, 2 feet of stone-lined shaft a day, taking turns going down in a rope harness with a short-handled spade. 35 feet before they hit water. Hazel was the one down in the shaft when the water came up. She felt it before she saw it, a cold that climbed through the stone under her palms. And then the floor of the shaft went soft, and the water rose around her boots, and she hollered up at Emmett to pull the rope. The water was sweet. That was the first thing they both said. Not sweet like sugar, sweet like the absence of everything you expected to taste. No iron, no mineral chalk, no lime, no mud. Just cold and clean, and Emmett said it once, years later, to his neighbor Wick Sawyer, like something that wanted you to have it. Wick Sawyer remembered that sentence for the rest of his life. They built the cabin 40 feet from the well because the cabin had to go where the ground was level and the well had to go where the water was. And 40 feet was the distance those two facts allowed. In the mornings, Hazel walked to the well first. Before coffee, before the stove, before anything. She drew the bucket up and she drank from it, standing there in whatever weather was happening, and she said it was the best part of every day for 27 years. That's not sentiment. That's the kind of specific thing that people say when they mean it literally. The best part of every day. Emmett drank from the well his whole life and was never sick. And that sentence sounds like ordinary luck until you know what ordinary sickness looked like in eastern Kentucky in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. Typhoid still moved through the county occasionally. Pellagra. Pneumonia took 2 or 3 people in every hollow every winter, the way it always had, the way people accepted it because accepting it was the only available option. Children died of things that have been curable for a century now. Men Emmett's age died at 50 of hearts that had simply used up their allotment of effort in coal mines and on hillside farms. Emmett reached 50 and kept going. His hair went gray, his joints ached in cold weather the way joints do, but he didn't get sick. A head cold once, in 1938. He mentioned it to Hazel as if it were a notable event, because it was. Hazel had not had so much as a head cold in longer than she could recall. Their nearest neighbor, a woman named Bertie Fugate, who had 4 children and a husband who worked the mines, lost 2 of those children before they reached 10 years old. Bertie herself had a cough that never fully left her from about 1930 onward. She used water from a different source, a spring higher up the ridge. Nobody connected anything at the time. People didn't make those connections. You were healthy or you weren't. And if you were, you thanked God and kept working. The well sat at the center of the homestead the way a fire sits at the center of a room, everything organized in relation to it. The garden ran along the south fence. The chicken house sat 20 feet east of the cabin. The livestock trough, a long wooden box Emmett had built and tarred against leaking, sat just downhill from the well, so that overflow from the filled bucket would run down into it without wasted effort. The animals drank from that trough. The animals were healthy, more than healthy, but that's a thread we'll pull later. For now, the homestead, the hollow, the well at the center, 2 people who had no particular reason to question any of it. Emmett Combs died on a Tuesday in October 1947. Not from illness. His heart was sound, his lungs were clear. His blood pressure had been checked exactly once by a doctor passing through Hazard and declared unremarkable. He died because a white oak on the ridge above the cabin had been leaning the wrong direction for years, and the wet summer had loosened its roots. And on a Tuesday morning when Emmett was walking the fence line below the ridge, it fell. The sound carried down the hollow and reached Hazel at the garden. And she knew what it was before she knew what it was. The way you know certain sounds in your body before your mind catches up with them. He died before she reached him. The tree was across his chest and he was already gone, and the oak leaves were still moving from the fall, orange and copper, and catching the October light. And Hazel stood there with her hand on his shoulder for a long time. Wick Sawyer helped her get the tree off. It took most of the afternoon. Wick was in his late 50s by then, widowed himself, a tall man with a permanent list to one side from a mining injury, and he didn't say much while they worked, which was the right thing to do. He did say, at the end of it, that Emmett was a good man. Hazel said she knew that. That was the whole conversation. She buried Emmett on the ridge, on the south-facing slope where the sun reached in winter, and she came back down to the cabin alone, and she sat on the porch steps with her three-fingered hand open on her knee, and the hollow settled around her in the early evening dark, and the well sat 40 feet away in the grass, and she was 53 years old and alone for the first time in her adult life. She went inside and lit the stove. She didn't cry for another 6 weeks, not because she wasn't grieving, but because grief, in Hazel's understanding of the world, was something you completed before you acknowledged it. In those first weeks without Emmett, the homestead became very quiet. It's a specific kind of quiet. Anyone who has lived alone in the country knows it, where the sounds that are present become louder, precisely because the sounds you're used to are gone. The creak of two people's weight on floorboards rather than one, the difference in the fire when someone else has fed it, the way the evening meal sounds when you set one plate instead of two. Hazel worked. That was what she did. She kept the garden through the fall, put the harvest up, banked the cabin against the winter. She drew water from the well every morning and drank it standing in the yard in the same way she always had. And it was still sweet and cold and clean, and she was grateful for it in the uncomplicated way she'd always been grateful for it. But now that she was alone in the evenings, she sat on the porch longer than she had before, and she started to hear things she hadn't noticed. The well was 40 feet away. On quiet evenings you could hear it. Not the well itself, no, there's nothing to hear from a well at rest. Just the stone and the dark and the water down inside it. But Hazel started noticing that on still evenings there was a sound from that direction. Not every evening, not reliably, but enough times that by December she'd started paying attention to when it happened and when it didn't.
The sound was difficult to describe. She never described it directly to anyone who wrote it down or remembered it clearly. What we have is secondhand, filtered through June's memory and Wick Sawyer's accounts. What Hazel apparently said once was that it sounded like water that was thinking about something. She didn't say this as if it were alarming. She said it the way you describe any natural feature you've learned to read, the way you describe the sound of wind before rain, or the sound of a creek when it's about to flood. Observational, clinical, almost. She started paying attention to the water itself that winter. The bucket always came up full. The well level didn't drop the way other wells in the hollow dropped in dry seasons. She knew this because Wick had mentioned it during a dry summer in the early 40s, said Hazel's well held better than anyone else's in the hollow, and Hazel had nodded and not thought much about it. Wells varied. That was normal, but alone now, with more time to observe things without someone else's presence filling in the silences, she started noticing specifics. In the mornings, the water was cold and clean and tasted the way it always had. Sweet, pure, that remarkable absence of everything you expected to find in groundwater. But in the evenings, particularly in the late evenings when she drew a bucket for the next morning's cooking, the water was different. Thicker, not visibly thicker. It looked the same. It poured the same. But in the mouth it had more weight to it, and the sweetness was more pronounced. Not unpleasant. More than not unpleasant, it was extraordinary, that nighttime water. And that was the thing that finally made Hazel uncomfortable. Something that good coming up from the ground, with no explanation for why. She started timing it. This is characteristic of Hazel in a way that I find both admirable and, in retrospect, quietly alarming. She didn't panic, she tested. She lowered the bucket on a measured rope at noon and noted how long before it hit the water. 30 feet, give or take, depending on the season. She did the same thing at midnight. The rope hit water at 28 feet. She measured it again the next night. 28 feet. She measured at noon the following day. 30 feet. 2 feet of difference between noon and midnight. The water level in the well rose at night. Hazel sat with this information for a week before she talked to anyone about it. The person she talked to was Wick Sawyer. She walked over to his place on a gray January morning, and Wick was in the barn doing something with a harness, and Hazel stood in the barn door and said, "The water level in my well rises at night by about 2 feet and falls again by morning." Wick set down the harness. "You sure?" "I measured it." Wick was quiet for a moment. He was a man who took his time with information, turned it over, looked at its underside before he said anything about it. "Could be tidal influence," he said finally. "Deep aquifers, sometimes they follow the moon." "I thought of that," Hazel said. "It's not regular enough. It's not every night. It's more nights than not, but not all of them." Another silence. "How long you think it's been doing that?" Wick asked. Hazel looked at him. "I don't know. I only started measuring in December." She went home and kept measuring. January, February, into the spring of 1948. The pattern held. The level was higher at night than in the day, on most nights, by approximately 2 feet. Some nights more. Some nights, particularly in what she came to think of as the responsive nights. Nights when the sound from the well was more distinct, when she could hear it from the porch clearly, that slow liquid thinking sound. The level was nearly 3 feet higher. She was not yet afraid. Let me be clear about that, because it matters. Hazel Combs was not a fearful woman, and she was not reacting to fear here. She was watching, measuring, thinking. The water was still good. The best water she'd ever had. Her joints didn't ache in the mornings the way she might have expected for a 54-year-old woman who worked as hard as she did. She had energy. She slept well. She felt, and this is the word she used, apparently, in a conversation with June much later. She felt maintained, like something that's been carefully kept. The problem was she was starting to understand what was doing the keeping. June Combs arrived in March of 1948. She was Hazel's niece by marriage, Emmett's brother's girl, and she'd lost her own parents to a house fire in Knott County the previous fall, and the family had sorted out where she'd go, and where she'd go was Hazel's. Hazel agreed to this without complaint and without particular warmth either, which was Hazel's way.
She prepared the small bedroom off the kitchen, and she went to Hazard to collect June from the bus station. And June stepped off the bus with a canvas bag and a face full of grief that was only half healed. And Hazel looked at her and said, "You can cry as much as you need to, not in front of me." June was 16 years old. She was thin in the way that teenagers are thin when they haven't been eating properly, all angles and restless energy, with dark hair that she kept in a braid that was perpetually unraveling, and a habit of asking questions she already suspected the answers to, just to see if the answers matched. She was not an easy person to have around. She was also, clearly, someone who was going to be all right eventually. She had that quality that grief sometimes sharpens in young people, a kind of watchfulness, an attention to the world that hadn't been there before. She settled into the homestead quickly, took on chores without being asked, learned the garden layout within a week, learned the chickens' names within 3 days. She drew water from the well every morning and drank it the way you drink water when you're thirsty, without ceremony, and she said immediately that it was the best water she'd ever tasted. Hazel watched her drink it and said nothing. The spring and summer passed. June put weight back on, got color in her face, worked alongside Hazel in the garden in the long evenings. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them had become comfortable. A thing that takes time and shared labor to build, and which, once built, is its own form of communication. Hazel noticed June's grief shifting into something quieter and more workable. She noticed that June was strong and quick, and that she learned things once. She also noticed, by late summer, that June didn't look like she was aging. This sounds dramatic. It wasn't at first. Teenagers don't age visibly over the course of a season. But Hazel had been watching June since March, and she had the impression, the strong, specific, unsettling impression, that June looked younger in September than she had in March. Not dramatically younger, not impossibly younger, but something in the proportion of her face, something in the tightness of her skin, something around the eyes. June in September looked more like 14 than 16. Hazel said nothing. She kept watching. And then, one evening in late September, June said, "Does the water taste different to you at night?" Hazel was at the stove. She didn't turn around. "What do you mean?" "From the well. The water I drew this morning tastes like water. The water I drew last night, it was sweeter, thicker almost, like it had more to it." Hazel turned around now. Her face was white. June said years later that she'd never seen Hazel's face do that before. Go white like that, all at once. Not gradually. The way faces go pale from cold or illness, but instantly, as if the color had been taken rather than drained, like something had reached in and pulled it out. "You drew water at night?" Hazel said. "I was thirsty. It was late. I didn't want to wake you." A silence. "How many times?" Hazel said. June thought about it. "A few times a week. Since summer. It's better at night. I started preferring it." Hazel sat down. This was also something June had never seen. Hazel sitting down in the middle of the day in the kitchen without a task in front of her. She sat down and she put her 3-fingered hand flat on the table, and she looked at it for a long time. "Don't draw water at night anymore," she said finally. "Why?" "I said don't." June looked at her. "You know something about it." Hazel looked up. Something moved across her face. Not anger, not quite. Resolution. The look of someone who has reached the end of a long deliberation. "I'm going to look at it," Hazel said. "Tonight. I need you to help me with the rope." The smell of the well at night was different from the smell in the day. Hazel had noticed this before and hadn't assigned it any particular meaning. Smells change at night. The cool air settles. Things that evaporate in the heat of the day pool at ground level in the dark. But standing at the well rim at midnight with June holding the lantern and the rope coiled at their feet, the smell was very clear and very distinct. Clean. Intensely clean. The kind of clean that has nothing in it at all, and no earth smell, no mineral smell, no biological richness of any kind. Like the absence of smell had become its own smell. The stones of the well rim were warm. Hazel pressed her palm against them to be sure, and they were warm, distinctly warm, warmer than the night air had any business making them. She ran her hand along the inside of the rim, where the stones descended into the shaft, and the warmth increased as her arm went lower. Not hot, not alarming, but steady and present and wrong. She tied the lantern to the rope, a tin lantern, small, the kind that throws a dim circle of yellow light. She lowered it slowly, hand over hand, the rope sliding through her palms, and she and June Augie leaned over the rim and watched it descend. At 10 feet, stone. The well was dug through shale and sealed with fitted fieldstone, dry laid, each stone chosen for how it'd hold against the one beside it. Emmett had been proud of this wall. In the lantern light it looked the same as it always had, and gray stone, a little damp, higher up, the smell of cold earth. At 20 feet, the smell changed. The cleanliness intensified, and beneath it something else. Something that didn't have a name exactly. Not sweet. Not the sweetness of the water. Something more fundamental than sweet. Something that lived below the word for what it was. June made a sound beside her. Not alarm, something else. Recognition almost. Like something familiar arriving from an unexpected direction. At 30 feet, the lantern touched the water. The water surface was lit from above now, the lantern barely clearing it, and Hazel could see the water in that small circle of light. It was moving, not rippling from the disturbance of the lowered lantern, not the slow oscillation of water disturbed and settling. It was moving directionally, circulating as if stirred by something below the surface, turning in a slow, consistent arc around the interior of the well. Hazel watched it for several seconds to be sure she wasn't misreading it. She was not misreading it. The water was moving in a circle, steady and deliberate, the way water moves when something below it is moving. She lowered the lantern another 6 inches, so its light spread further across the surface. At the edge of the lantern's reach, near the stone wall of the well, there was something in the water. Not floating, not swimming. The word that comes closest, but that still isn't right, is present. It was present within the water, the way a current is present within a river, not a separate thing from the water, but a distinct thing within it, a shape that was darker than the water around it, not opaque, but denser, like the difference between clear glass and tinted glass, like shadow with weight. It was moving toward the light, not quickly, not aggressively. The way a plant moves toward sun, that slow, definite lean in a direction. Curious. That's the word Hazel used later. She said it looked curious. She pulled the lantern up. Her hands were steady, pulling the rope, hand over hand at a controlled pace. Not panicking, not rushing, just purposeful. The lantern came up. The light left the water surface. 30 feet of rope came up and was coiled at her feet, and the lantern was back in June's hand. Hazel looked into the dark of the well shaft for a moment. Then she put the wooden cover back over the opening. She picked up the lantern from June and walked back to the cabin. Behind them in the well, the sound came up through the opening. Both of them heard it. Slow and liquid and deliberate, that thinking sound. And then the wooden cover muffled it, and then the cabin door was between them and the well, and Hazel put the lantern on the table and said, "Don't draw water from that well anymore, morning or night." Hazel. June. Her voice was quiet, which was worse than if it had been loud. "I need you to hear me. Don't draw from it." June sat down in the chair opposite the table. She was 17 years old, and she looked, in the lamplight, 14. Her braid was coming undone the way it always was. "What was it?" she said. Hazel thought about this for a long time. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, an owl called and went quiet. I don't know what it is, Hazel said finally. I know what it does. She let that sit. And I need to think about what I know, she said, before I say anything else about it. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and she thought about Emmett. Emmett, who had been healthy his whole life. Emmett, who had drunk from that well every day of the 27 years they'd lived here. Emmett, who had died because a tree fell wrong on a Tuesday morning, which had nothing to do with his health, which was its own kind of data. A man preserved by whatever was in that water, killed anyway by ordinary chance. The world not caring about whatever arrangements he'd made with the thing in the well. She thought about her own body. The absence of illness for 3 decades. The morning she woke up at 54 feeling like she'd woken up at 34. The way her hands worked. The 3-fingered left and the full right. With a sureness she had no right to expect from hands that had worked as hard as hers. She thought about the shape in the water, moving toward the light. Not threatening, she kept coming back to that. It hadn't felt threatening, it had felt like something noticing her. The way a mind notices something new. That was the thing that kept her awake until the gray early morning. Not that it was monstrous. That it wasn't. The gift had been real. The gift was also, she understood now, the reason she'd been drawing from that well for 27 years without questioning what made it so good. She'd known, at some level she could now identify that the water was improbable. She'd known when Emmett mentioned to Wick that it seemed to want you to have it. She'd known when they'd stayed healthy through decades that took people twice as healthy as them. She'd known and she'd kept drawing water because the water was extraordinary and the life it gave them was the only life she'd had. She'd let it continue because stopping would have meant understanding it. And now she understood it, and stopping was the only available thing. The next morning she went to the well and drew a bucket and carried it to the cabin and set it on the stove table and didn't drink from it. She watched it all morning. The water was still, caught in a shaft of sunlight through the kitchen window, clear as glass. Absolutely clear, and it smelled of nothing. That absence of smell. She poured it out at noon. She told June to drink water from the creek. June argued this, as June argued everything, not from stubbornness, but from the need to understand before she complied. She asked questions. Hazel answered some of them. The shape in the water, the rising level, the warmth of the stones, what she'd noticed about June's face and what she believed it meant. June went quiet at that. I look younger, she said. Yes, but that's a good thing. Hazel looked at her steadily. Is it? Not a question, just the 2 words flat, set down for June to pick up and examine. June was 17 years old and she was smart, and she sat with it. I don't know what's keeping me young, she said finally. No, Hazel said, you don't. And you don't either. No, and it could be fine. Hazel said nothing. Or it could not be, June said. She went to the creek to get water. She didn't argue about it again. What followed was a period of months that had the texture of experiment, which is to say of controlled uncertainty. Hazel stopped drinking the well water entirely. Within the first 2 weeks, her right knee began to ache in the evenings, something that hadn't happened in years. Within a month, she woke one morning with a stuffed head and a raw throat. Her first head cold in longer than she could accurately remember. Somewhere between 15 and 20 years, she thought, though she couldn't be certain. It lasted 4 days and resolved on its own. She noted all of this without complaint and without changing course. June drank from the creek, and it showed. Not dramatically, not all at once. The way a tide turns, where you can't see the exact moment, but you look up later, and the beach is different. By December, June looked 17. By the following spring, she looked 18. The cheeks filled out slightly, the sharpness of her features softened a degree. Something around the eyes shifted into a slightly later register of young. She grew half an inch. All of this was ordinary, unremarkable development. It looked from the outside like a girl growing up. From the inside, from Hazel's vantage, who had watched her look progressively younger for 8 months, it looked like a clock that had been stopped being allowed to run again. Meanwhile, Hazel was measuring the well level. Every morning and every evening she lowered the marked rope into the shaft and pulled it out and recorded the water line. She kept these measurements in a small notebook she'd bought in Hazard, the only notebook she is known to have owned, and which has never been found among her effects. The numbers she told Wick Sawyer and which Wick told others, and which eventually made their way into the family's loose oral record, were these. The well level had risen approximately 1 inch per month over the preceding year. In the 12 months between October 1947, when Emmett died and Hazel began paying close attention, and October 1948, the water in the well had risen approximately 12 inches. The well was 35 feet deep. The water had been sitting at 30 feet down for most of their lives on the homestead. It was now at 29 feet, and the rate appeared to be accelerating. She walked over to Wick Sawyer's place in November of 1948. Wick was on the porch mending something, and Hazel sat on the steps and told him most of what she knew. Not the shape in the water. She kept that for reasons she didn't explain to herself. But the rising level, the health effects, what she'd noticed about June. Wick listened without interrupting. He had a way of listening that involved no reaction at all on his face, which was either very reassuring or deeply alarming depending on what you were saying. "That cow of mine," he said when she finished. Hazel waited. "The one I bought off Harlan County in 45. Brown-eyed. You remember her?" "I remember her. Her eyes are blue now." He said it matter-of-factly. "Turned in the last 8 months or so. Started pale at the edges, now they're blue clear through. I've been watching it. I thought I was wrong about what color they'd been." Hazel was quiet for a moment. "She drinks from the trough." "She does." He picked up the mending again. "My dog," he said. "How old do you think my dog is?" Hazel looked at Wick's dog, who was sleeping on the porch in the thin November sun. A large brown dog, no particular breed. The kind of dog that results from 200 years of Appalachian dogs producing whatever shape comes out. "He looks 5-6 years, Hazel said. "I got him in 1924, Wick said. Hazel looked at the dog for a long time. "He drinks from the trough when he comes visiting," Wick said. "Not regular, but often enough." The trough sat downhill from the well, filled by overflow from the bucket, when Hazel drew water. The animals drank from it. The water in the trough was not well water exactly. It was well water that had sat in the open air and lost some of whatever quality made it distinct. Diluted, maybe. Secondhand. Whatever the water did, it did it in a smaller, slower way from the trough. "She's going to have to be sealed," Hazel said. "Not a question." Wick didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "That's a lot to give up." "I know what it is." Do you? She looked at him. You know what it does, Wick said with a precision that surprised her. You know it keeps things alive. You don't know what it wants for it. She walked home. The afternoon was pale and cold, the hollow already in shadow before 3 o'clock, the ridge above the cabin dark against a dark gray sky. The well was 40 feet from the porch, a round stone opening with its wooden cover, and she stood and looked at it for a while. What Wick had said was a version of what she already knew. She'd been dancing around it for a year. The water kept things healthy, kept them alive, kept them young, kept them in better condition than they had any reasonable claim to be in. Emmett, herself, Wick's dog and cow. June. Those strange months when she'd been drinking nightly and looking younger than her age. The gift was real. Nobody was arguing the gift wasn't real. The shape in the water was also real. She could have lived her whole life taking the gift and not looking at where it came from. People do that all the time. The gift was good and the water was sweet, and the alternative was creek water and normal aging and head colds in November and a knee that ached in the evenings. What she couldn't do, and this was the thing she'd been working through for over a year now, was continue without acknowledging what she'd already understood. She'd known the water was improbable. She'd known it since the first summer. She'd drawn from it for 27 years because it was good and she hadn't wanted to question good things, and she'd let Emmett drink from it, and she'd kept the overflow trough, and she'd let the animals drink from that, and she'd let June move in and drink from it, and none of that had felt like a choice until now, when it did. Whatever was in the well was rising, an inch a month, accelerating. It was curious. She knew it was curious. She'd seen that, the shape moving toward the light. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't doing harm. It was doing benefit in the way something does benefit when it can reach you. The question was, what happened when it reached the top? Not when it reached the surface of the water. When it reached the surface of the well. She didn't know. That was the honest answer. She didn't know. But she understood enough about gifts to know that a gift given freely and continuously over decades by something you couldn't see and couldn't name and couldn't have a conversation with was a gift that had terms. She just didn't know what they were yet. She was not willing to find out. She went inside and ate supper and slept without dreaming. And in the morning she walked to Hazard and bought a bag of Portland cement and a length of steel plate. And she came home and built a fire in the yard and got out the welding kit she'd been using since she was 30 years old, and she made herself a steel ring that would fit over the well rim, and she bolted it to the stone, and she mixed the concrete in the bucket she'd drawn well water in for 27 years, and she poured it. She did this over the course of a Wednesday. June came out of the cabin at noon and stood in the yard and watched. You decided? June said. Yes. Do you want help? Hazel looked up from the rim. Concrete on her hands, steel plate curing around the bolts, the wooden cover inside the cabin forever now. I want you to go tell Wick I'll need help moving the trough tomorrow. June went. Hazel kept working. The concrete went on in 2 layers, with a night's curing between them. She poured the first layer that Wednesday afternoon, 3 inches thick, and she covered it with a canvas tarp against the night dew, and she went inside and slept. She woke at some hour in the deep of the night to the sound from the well, through the concrete, which hadn't fully cured, which was still porous, which still carried sound through its body the way half-set material does. The sound came up. That slow liquid sound, the thinking sound, but different now. Not just circulating, more active. something below that was aware of what was happening above. She lay in the bed and listened to it for a while. It wasn't angry. She had the clear sense, not a comforting sense, not a frightening one, just a clear one, that it wasn't angry. Confusion, maybe. Or the thing that exists before confusion. When you're aware something has changed, but you don't know yet what the change means. She thought about the shape in the water moving toward the light when she'd lowered the lantern. Curious. The same quality, something that noticed new things. She turned over and went back to sleep. The next morning she poured the second layer. 3 more inches of concrete. She set 3 bolts into the surface before it hardened for purchase, so nothing could be worked up from below by pressure or by time. She smoothed the surface with a trowel. She was a precise worker, always had been, and the cap was level and tight, fitted against the steel ring. And when it cured, it was as solid as the hillside itself. When it was done, she stood up and looked at it. A round concrete cap, 12 inches thick in total, bolted to a steel plate, seated on stone. The well beneath it, the water, the dark, the shape in the water, whatever was rising, sealed. She put her palm flat on the concrete surface. It was warm, not from the sun, which hadn't cleared the ridge yet. Warm from below. The same warmth the stones had carried when she'd run her hand along the inside of the rim. She lifted her hand. She walked to the cabin. She told June, when June came into the kitchen, that the well was sealed and they would carry water from the creek. "For how long?" June said. "For as long as I live here," Hazel said. "After that, it's somebody else's decision." She never opened it, not once in the 23 years that remained to her. Not in the dry summers when the creek ran low and brown and the water had to be boiled before it was safe to drink. Not in the winters when she had to break ice to get to the creek and carry the bucket up the frozen path to the cabin with her hands going numb on the bale. Not when her knee ached, or when she was tired, or when the creek water tasted of iron and mud the way creek water does in spring. She walked to the creek every morning and every evening, and she carried her water back, and she left the well sealed. June stayed until 1951, when she married a man from Letcher County and moved east. She never drank from the well again after that September night in 1948, when Hazel's face went white. She looked her age when she married. She looked her age when she had children and when she raised them and when she grew old. She told the story in pieces to her own children, who told it in pieces to theirs, and some of those pieces made it to me and some of them are lost. She said once, this was recorded in a letter to Hazel that we have, that she sometimes thought about the nighttime water, the sweetness of it, how it was better than any water she'd had since. She didn't say this with longing exactly. She said it the way you describe a country you left when you were young. Precisely remembered. Irretrievable. Not quite real. Wick Sawyer helped Hazel move the trough in November of 1948. They dug it up and moved it to the far side of the property, downhill from the garden, where it collected rainwater instead. The cow with the blue eyes was sold to a farm in Breathitt County in 1949. What happened to her after that? Whether her eyes faded back to brown, whether the changes reversed? Nobody kept track of. The dog lived until 1952, 28 years. Wick noted this to Hazel, and Hazel acknowledged it, and neither of them said anything else about it. Wick said a few years before his own death that he had always respected what Hazel had done, but that he hadn't known until he'd watched her do it whether he could have done it himself. He'd been drinking from that overflow trough his whole life, too, in a secondary way, through the animals and through the water he took from the bucket when he visited. He'd been healthy, unusually healthy, he acknowledged. He'd been watching all those years with a clarity he chose not to act on. I told myself it was the land, he said, the water and the limestone. That's what I told myself. He paused. Hazel never told herself anything. She just watched until she knew. He paused again. And then she did what she knew she had to do, and she didn't complain about it. Hazel Combs died in August of 1972. She was 78 years old. Her heart stopped in the night. Clean, quiet, no preamble. And she was found in the morning by a neighbor who'd come by to check on her after she hadn't answered a wave from the road the previous day. The cabin was in good order, the way Hazel's things were always in good order. The garden had been weeded within the week. There was bread on the table. The doctor said her heart had simply stopped, the way hearts do eventually, and that aside from that she appeared to have been in remarkable health. Joints showed less wear than expected for her age and her history of labor. Lungs were clear. She'd had no prescriptions, no regular treatments, no ongoing conditions. She'd been drinking creek water for 24 years. She hadn't seen a doctor in longer than that. She had outlived most of the women she'd grown up with, most of the men too, and she'd worked harder than nearly all of them through the same years. The well water's effects apparently don't end when you stop drinking the water. She'd sealed away the thing that had been keeping her. She'd made that choice deliberately, knowing what she was choosing. She'd carried creek water for 24 years as a kind of, not penance exactly, refusal. Conscious refusal of a gift she couldn't accept with full understanding. And the gift, it seemed, had left something behind anyway. Not forever. She was 78 and she died. But something. Wick Sawyer was not at the funeral. He died the previous winter. I think about this sometimes. What those two people knew, what they'd seen and watched and measured and kept quiet about for 25 years. What they talked about on the rare occasions they talked about it. Whether it felt, in the end, like the right decision or just like the only one. The property sat vacant after Hazel's death. It passed through the family in that slow, complicated way that property does. A will and a counterclaim and a decade of nobody particularly wanting a hollow-side cabin without plumbing or electricity in Perry County. By the time Della Caudle inherited it in 1998, the cabin needed work and the garden was wild and the property had the quality that abandoned places have. Not malevolent, just indifferent. Things had kept growing without being tended the way things do. Della was in her early 30s, newly divorced, a pragmatic woman who'd grown up hearing the family stories in the same fragmentary way I had, Hazel's name attached to small, disconnected facts. The welding, the creek water, the well. She was not particularly interested in the supernatural or the historical. She was interested in whether the cabin's foundation was sound and whether the ridge above it showed signs of erosion and what it would cost to run electric in from the road. She found the well on her second day on the property. She'd known it was there. The family stories mentioned it. But she'd forgotten or hadn't quite believed the reality of it. The concrete cap sitting flush on the steel ring, bolted down, Hazel's careful work. Nearly 50 years of weather on it, and the concrete had cracked. A single crack across the surface, running from the north bolt to the south edge. Maybe a 1/4 inch wide, widening slightly at the midpoint. The bolts had rusted, but they held. The steel plate beneath showed surface rust but was structurally intact. The whole assembly was still, by any reasonable measure, sealed. The grass around the well grew in a circle. Della noticed this before she noticed the crack. The grass within about 4 feet of the well rim in every direction was different from the grass beyond, darker green, thicker, growing with a specific intentionality that grass in a field doesn't usually have. A perfect circle of extraordinarily healthy grass, and then ordinary grass beginning at its edge, and the well at the center. It had been like this presumably for years, decades. She knelt at the rim and looked at the crack. The 1/4-inch gap, wider at the midpoint, running across the concrete face. She could feel air moving through it. A faint, steady exhalation, like a building breathing through a gap in its wall. Cold, clean. The smell of it was the same smell that came off the water in the bucket when Hazel drew it. The absence smell. The improbable cleanliness. 50 years sealed under concrete, and it still smelled like nothing. Which is to say, like everything, that nothing isn't. She pressed her ear to the crack. The sound was liquid. Moving liquid, not dripping, not rushing, not thus the random movement of water in a closed space finding its level. Moving with intention. A slow circulation, steady and deliberate. She pressed her ear harder against the concrete and the sound clarified. Liquid moving. Slowly. As if considering its direction. As if each movement were the result of a decision rather than of physics. She stayed like that for several minutes. Long enough that the concrete's residual warmth, still present after 50 years, transferred through her cheekbone. Long enough for her eyes to adjust to the grass at the level of the ground, the dark circle of it, each blade distinct. She stood up. She dusted off her knees. She took out her phone and called a contractor in Hazard named Dale Whitaker, who'd done work for her aunt's estate before, and she said, "I have a well on the property. The concrete cap is cracked. I need it resealed." Dale Whitaker came out the following Saturday with a bag of Portland cement and a trowel, the same basic materials Hazel had used, and he looked at the cap and he ran his hand along the crack and he said it was a straightforward job. Clean the crack, pack it with hydraulic cement, pour a new layer on top. 6 inches ought to do it. He mixed the cement in a bucket. Della stood back. The morning was cool and still, the kind of eastern Kentucky morning in early summer, where the light comes down the ridge in a specific way that makes everything look preliminary, like the day hasn't committed to itself yet. Birds in the tree line, the smell of concrete mixing. Dale poured the new layer. As the concrete spread across the old surface, covering the crack, filling in and leveling words, the sound changed. Della heard it first. She said it started below the register where you hear with your ears, felt it in her sternum before she recognized it as a sound, a vibration that climbed from the ground through her boot soles and up through her body. Then it became audible, low, steady, almost regular. Not the liquid sound she'd heard through the crack. Not the thinking water sound. Something below that. Dale Whitaker heard it when the concrete was half poured. He stopped pouring and stood up and looked at her. He was a practical man in his 50s, not given to drama. He stood holding the bucket, and he listened and he didn't say anything for about 30 seconds. "What is that?" he said. "Concrete settling," Della said, which was not what she believed, but was the available answer. Dale looked at the well. He looked at her. He set the bucket down carefully and picked up the trowel and finished spreading the concrete. His movements were deliberate and unhurried. the movements of someone who has decided to complete a task, regardless of what's happening around the task. The vibration continued while he worked. Low, steady, almost musical. Almost in the sense that music organizes sound into meaning, and this was organized. And the organization felt intentional, felt like something that knew it was being heard. When the concrete was spread and level, Dale stood up and wiped the trowel on his pants and listened for another moment. Like it was humming, he said, like it was pleased. He packed up his tools, he gave Della a bill and she paid him, and he drove down the hollow toward the road. And she stood alone in the yard with the freshly poured concrete and the dark circle of grass and the morning light on the ridge. She listened. The vibration was fading now, not stopping exactly, but retreating, going back down into whatever depth it came from, going back to the long patience it must have had before the concrete cracked enough to let a sound through, to let a smell through, to let whatever small notice it had taken of the world above go. The grass around the well was exactly as it had been. She went inside and she thought about what she'd heard, and she thought about Hazel carrying creek water for 23 years, and she made coffee on the stove she'd had carried in, and she drank it standing at the window looking out at the yard. She moved to Hazard. She rents the cabin out occasionally to hunters. Though she doesn't tell them about the well, there's nothing to tell them technically. The well is sealed. It's not a functioning water source. She kept the plumbing she put in. The renters use that. She visits the property twice a year, spring and fall. She walks the property line, checks the cabin, checks the garden where things grow, whether anyone plants them or not. She checks the well. The new concrete holds. The grass circle holds. Darker, thicker, more deliberate than the grass around it. Every time she visits, she walks to the rim and she stands there for a moment, and she does not press her ear to the concrete. She told me once that she'd thought about opening it, that in the first years after she'd sealed it with Dale, she'd thought about it often. What was down there? Whether it was what the stories implied, whether Hazel had been right or whether Hazel had been a woman alone in grief, making a fearful decision and throwing away something that was ultimately only ever generous. And then I'd think about the grass, she said. We were sitting on the porch of the cabin and she was looking at the well across the yard, the concrete cap pale in the afternoon light. The grass, I said. It's been growing like that for 50 years, she said. Minimum, probably longer, probably since Hazel dug the well and the overflow started running into the soil. She paused. Whatever is down there doesn't need the seal to be open to reach things. It already reaches things. The grass. Whatever it did to Hazel that lasted 24 years after she stopped drinking the water. Wick's dog. She picked up her coffee. It's patient, she said. It was patient for a year while Hazel sealed it. It's been patient since. The humming when the new concrete went on, Dale said, pleased. And I thought about that word for a long time. I asked her what she thought it meant. She looked at the well for a moment. I think pleased might have been right, she said. I just don't know what it was pleased about. I've stood at that well 3 times. The concrete holds. The grass circle is precisely what she described. On still mornings, if the hollow is quiet enough and you put your face close to the surface of the cap, you can feel the warmth rising through the stone. Not heat, a steadiness, like something that maintains a constant temperature because it has never been cold. I carry a water bottle from home when I visit. I fill it at a gas station in Hazard on the way in. I drink from it and not from the creek. Hazel made the right decision. I believe that. I believe she understood that you cannot accept a gift from something you cannot see and cannot know and cannot have any kind of honest transaction with. Because the thing you're accepting isn't really a gift. It's the opening of a relationship. And the terms of that relationship belong to something that isn't you. But I also believe she grieved it. The sweetness of the water, the way her body felt in those 27 years, Emmett's health, his whole good long life right up until the oak fell. All of it given freely without visible cost, by something patient and curious and, as best as anyone could tell, not unkind. She walked to the creek every morning for 23 years. She dipped her bucket in the iron-brown water and she carried it home, and she boiled it when necessary, and she drank it and she went on. And whatever the well had given her, it had given enough to last. The well is still sealed. The shape is still in the water, 40 feet down, circulating slowly in the dark, rising at some imperceptible rate that no one is measuring now. The concrete holds, and the bolts hold, and the steel plate holds, and the grass grows in its perfect circle, and the hollow is exactly the same hollow it has always been. Close, quiet, the ridges pressing in from every side, the light reaching the floor for a few hours a day. If you put your ear to the crack, not the crack Dale filled, but the new hairline that has appeared along the south edge of the cap, a thin line barely visible, probably nothing. If you put your ear to that on a still morning in the early hours before the birds start, you would hear what Della heard in 1998 and what I heard in 2023. Liquid, moving slowly. Something in the water that is the water, that has always been the water, patient in the way that only very old things are patient, waiting in the way that things wait when they are not afraid of time. Still curious, still rising,